All right, now we start part three of this lecture, and we discuss some factors that impact bond yields. So we've already talked about how the yields on bonds might differ with the maturity of the bond, which we called the yield curve. And we talked about upward and downward sloping yield curves and flat yield curves. You can even have hump shaped yield curves where yields for intermediate maturity bonds are the highest or the lowest. Other factors that impact the yield on a bond is the default risk on the bond. That could be true for corporate bonds or even government bonds if you think a government might default on its bonds. And you have rating agencies that try to assess what the default risk of bonds is and attach ratings to the bonds, and that'll impact the yield or the prices people are willing to pay for the bond. And then there's a distinction we'll talk about in this part between nominal and real interest rates. So, what I want to discuss next is uh, this is a long time series from about 1920 to now, showing the yield to maturity, or on it's actually an index of yields on bonds that either had a triple A rating from Moody's Investor Service, that's a rating agency, and the triple A is the highest rating that you could get, and a Moody's Baa rating. So this is still an investment grade bond, but it's lower down in the rankings of investment grade. This is the top rating, and this is a lower down but still investment grade rating. It's not a junk rating yet. And what you see in this graph is consistently throughout history, the lower rated bond, or the one that Moody's thinks has a higher default risk, pays a higher yield. Here in the Great Depression, it paid a much higher yield. This is a yield of about 11% versus a yield of about 5% here. So that's quite a big difference. And then otherwise, you have this gap and you go through. And here in 2008, you also got a pretty big difference between the AAA bond down here and the Baa bond here. And then it is gone like this. So people often talk about yield spreads, which is the difference between the yield on the lower rated bond and the highly rated bond. And so this is a graph of yield spreads that you see, these are much more stationary. We see in the Great Depression almost a 6% yield spread here, quite high. And then here in 2008, over a 3% yield spread here. And in other time periods where we've had substantial yield spreads. Right now, I don't know if I got the daily, I think this is monthly data, but right now the yield spreads are not that high. Okay, another factor that is important is a difference between nominal and real interest rates. So nominal interest rates, a bond promises to pay you a certain number of dollars in the future, but what you're interested in is what those dollars can purchase when you receive them in the future. So you're going to be concerned about inflation. So you're kind of interested in what's the real interest rate offered by a bond. And so then we have to adjust the interest rate by inflation. So to give you a sense of this, this is a picture of interest rates on 10-year US government bonds from 1980 to now. And we see that there's been a big reduction from over 12% down to, close to zero. We've seen these interest rates are a fraction of a percent now, steadily declining over this 40-year period, these nominal interest rates. But a lot of this decline occurred because there was a decline in inflation. And if we look at the difference between the interest rate on the 10-year bond and an estimate of expected inflation, then we see that at the peak here, these interest rates were only, I shouldn't say only, but they were about 7 or maybe 8.5%. And they have also come down steadily, but now close to zero. So if you think about it, this is coming down from 12 or 14 to zero. of this decline in the nominal interest rate, this graph suggests about half of that was coming from a decline in inflation, and about half of that is coming from a decline in real interest rates. Now, when we get to the discussion of the growth model and the macroeconomic determinants of real interest rates, we often think of theories that would have the real interest rate be quite stable. So this decline is a puzzle, why it's happened. And when we look at history, this is a graph from this source right here for historical data that shows nominal and real interest rates in the United Kingdom from about 1870 to now. Back here in this time period, when Great Britain was the dominant country in the world, they probably had the biggest and most liquid bond markets. So this is often why that's the best data. But if you look at it, here's the nominal interest rate on United Kingdom or Great Britain 10-year bonds, the nominal rate. So it's like the US, it goes up to 15% and then has come down considerably. In this shaded area, we could see their inflation was kind of stable. It was very large during World War I, came down, but actually negative here. Very large again in World War II. They've had substantial inflation in the 1970s. They brought that down. So when you take a difference between the nominal rate and the inflation rate, which they try to smooth and give an estimate of expected inflation over the next 10 years, they arrived at this estimate of the real interest rate in Great Britain. So you see it's 2 or 3% quite a lot of the time. And then like in the US, it was high. In 1980, they have about 5%, and then it's come down. But a lot of economic theories think that the real interest rate should be quite stable, let's say 2 or 3%, maybe 4%, something like that, using historical data. Now, there's just been released a more recent paper that goes way back in time and tries to calculate real interest rates, as I say, going way back in time. This is to 1310. And I guess the author of this paper went and here, people I've never heard of, somebody made a loan to King Sigismund at 18% interest rate, or somebody else to Edward III at a 35% interest rate. So he went and looked at how kings in Europe, how much money they had to pay to borrow, and he has an estimate of inflation rates at this time. It was actually quite stable price level during this time. And he has points to here to all the different people who might be borrowing, on these loans. And he tries to take these data and say, well, we have what's he called? This is a moving average. And so it's moving around like this. And he draws a massive trend line through it and says, over the very long run, it seems like there's actually been what he calls a secular trend in declining real interest rates. And it seems to be a remarkable fit. So I thought that was an interesting paper. It's not been peer reviewed, and I'm not sure what impact it's had yet, but I thought that was a very nice picture. So that ends part 3, and I'll start up part 4.